Hi, it's Mickey again. This is going to be the video lecture for the Rousseau reading. So first of all, remember the Rousseau is on Blackboard as a Word document. Second of all, the last video was review, so it went a little quickly. This one will probably go a little quickly too, because of course there's not classmates to ask questions and raise helpful comments. I'm also not writing a bunch of stuff on the board. Having said that, remember to balance that out. This is a video. You could rewatch it as much as you want. You could rewind it. And also, since it's a YouTube video, if you want, you can turn on closed captioning if you find out that I'm speaking a little quickly, as I tend to do. So just bear in mind those resources, and also, just like before, can't emphasize enough that you can and should be posting questions and comments, applications, etc. on the Blackboard discussion board created for this purpose. Second thing, big picture, Rousseau is writing later, so he's writing the Discourse in 1755. Not that that's important. But he is explicitly responding to Hobbes. He mentions Hobbes by name. And one thing that's going to be important as we go through Unit 3 here is we really want to start comparing and contrasting Hobbes and Rousseau. Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? Etc. So it might be helpful to even kind of keep a table of agreements and disagreements. They agree on the big picture in the sense that they're trying to do the same project. So let's review about that. Pardon. They are imagining what humans are like and by nature, independent of society, and putting that into a situation where there is no society yet, and then seeing what is it about that kind of situation combined with human nature that leads us to government. Doing so should tell us some important stuff. So let's start with part one of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. What kind of being is a human for Rousseau? He explicitly says that humans are just another animal. They are able to fulfill their needs. They are like the other creatures in the wild. Now, will he agree with Hobbes that humans are rational and clever? Maybe. The answer is yes, but really, that's something that doesn't matter for Rousseau. The picture he depicts is different, and as such, rationality is downplayed. So let's talk about what things are like in the state of nature. Where's the one big point where he's going to disagree with Hobbes as a point of science, not as a point of philosophy, is the need for competition. He says, look, populations are incredibly small. There's plenty of food. If this scary looking person is over there at that apple tree, I'll just go find another one. And so a point about science rather than philosophy at which Hobbes and Rousseau disagree is the scarcity of goods. Uh, if there's enough to go around, we're just not going to kill each other over it. And that, by the way, leads to kind of this downplaying of rationality. Well, how much rationality do you need to knock some fruit out of a tree? Not much. In the state of nature, there's not an important difference in survival rates of someone with an 80 IQ or a 180 IQ. It is just not the kind of thing for which humans would concern themselves. However, since humans are just another animal, he does agree with Hobbes in that, first of all, humans are equal in the relevant sense, equally able to meet their needs. But since they're just another animal, he also agrees that there's no right or wrong, justice or injustice in the state of nature. Careful, note this. Even though there's no right or wrong, no morality or immorality in the state of nature, Rousseau says humans are naturally virtuous. So virtuous is different than moral. So we just naturally act in a way that tends to be compassionate towards other human beings. Um, we feel this natural repugnance to seeing other humans suffer. This point by Rousseau is good in that it has some science on its side. Think of very small children who will start crying if they see another kid get hurt. Uh, so there's an important, drastic disagreement about human nature. Hobbes says humans are naturally and primarily selfish, so naturally meaning in the state of nature. Rousseau says no, they're naturally virtuous, not moral, but virtuous. They're social animals, and that it has some important ramifications. So what happens? The Rousseau depiction of the state of nature is quite nice and idyllic. But and further, I should say not but, these natural inequalities just aren't important. Differences in intelligence don't matter, differences in beauty, they matter little in nature. So we're relevantly equal. Then it's society that magnifies inequality. And so let's talk about that. So this is shifting into part 2 of the Rousseau. First and foremost, a little bit careful with terminology. So for Hobbes, we're either in a state of nature or we are in a civil state, i.e. a government. Rousseau says, no, there's steps in between. We could have society without government. And that's important to understanding Rousseau and where he disagrees with Hobbes. So, what does society start with? Property. Interestingly enough, Rousseau says the first person who stakes out something and says, this is mine, such that no one else is allowed to use it, that is where the state of nature ends. Now, what is the first form of property? It sounds funny to think about, but family. One of the things that you do with a spouse is to say, this is mine, such that no others can use it. And so, family is really the first form of property in a sense, and it's also the first social unit. So notice, a family is a very small society, but it's a society without a government. And Rousseau thinks that Hobbes is wrong for not recognizing this. What happens in a family? Why would we go beyond families into eventually large governments? Quite simply, division of labor. So, and this is true of relationships now. So, because my spouse and I split the chores, we both have more leisure time. I do the things I'm good at, she does the things she's good at, in a roughly equal way. As a result, lots more leisure. And this is where human rationality starts to matter, because humans are clever enough to notice this. And we can, in fact, amplify it. We can continue this trend and say, well, wait a minute. If we have more people, we get more division of labor still, which leads to more leisure time. And so things that we used to think of as luxury become something that we can't do without. So overall, Rousseau says we are much stronger in the state of nature because each person is able to see to all their own needs. I bet if I dropped all of you separately at different places in the middle of nowhere in the desert, a lot of us would not do so well. And so it's society that kind of domesticates us through this division of labor. So first society is the family unit. But then you might think about the next society as, say, a couple of family units working together, almost like a commune. And this doesn't have a good snappy name. Some people have called it the tribal stage. I don't know if that's good or not. But the general idea is it just continues the trend. The more people we have, the more job specialization, the more leisure we have. So far, so good. But then this is where the nasty stuff comes up, because what ends up happening is that certain jobs are glamorized more than others. So I might be doing something like, latrine duty, not the most glamorous. But then when the hunter comes back with the boar on its back, Well, then there's this giant party and everybody wants to be the hunter, etc. And so jobs are not evaluated equally, even though my job actually probably saves more lives if I'm the latrine person. And so this is when negative stuff starts to happen between humans. We have all these nasty things like envy, jealousy, which leads to things like sabotage and cruelty and lying and all of this stuff that we just did not have because we didn't need it before. And here is where Rousseau breaks in and mentions Hobbes by name. He says, this is where we see things like conflict due to diffidence and glory, not much earlier. So, according to Rousseau, Hobbes's error is to treat humans who are already in a society as in a state of nature. So, yes, humans can be pieces of poo, we all know that. They can be jerks, but we're not naturally jerks. That's not a product of human nature, as Hobbes says. That is a product of society, competition, jealousy. All stuff not available, or sorry, not present in the state of nature, according to Rousseau. Notice, still no government. So, where does government occur? It has to do with what Rousseau calls iron and corn. Agriculture changes things importantly because agriculture, if you think about it, requires that in an important sense I have to treat a large portion of land as mine permanently because I'm the one putting in the work and harvesting the crops, etc. And that's something that's somewhat new on the scene. And so we have that within the societies, and as a result, something kind of funny happens. When we have this land that's distributed a certain way, combine that with inequality that has been being magnified through competition, and now we really see that there are inequalities that some people consider desirable and undesirable. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a bunch of land staked out as mine, I might want to keep it that way. And so how is a good way to do that is to, in a sense, formalize the mine, is to introduce this notion of rights. I have a right to this stuff, etc., i.e. a government. And so the government is introduced in order to concretize property rights, to make property rights official and permanent. Now, not everybody's going to want that. Who's going to want the property rights the way they are? The rich. And so ultimately, government is introduced as a way to have rich people keep their stuff or to make permanent inequalities. Now you say, well, that sounds terrible. First of all, as a country with the largest wealth gap in the world, there's probably something to it. But more importantly, notice the rich still have to sell it to the poor, or the ones who are getting the short end of the stick on this one. And what Rousseau says is that they see the benefits without seeing the dangers. And so as a result, they sell it, and by the time they realize the dangers, it's already too late because government's already there. And let me add one more thing, and this is really something probably Hobbes would agree with, is that one government necessitates all governments. Why? Because governments entail things like a standing army. And so if I'm a society that doesn't have a government, since Rousseau says those are possible, and all of a sudden that society across the way has a standing army of soldiers, what do I have to do in return? I have to have a standing army as well, which is going to require a government. So for Rousseau, one government necessitates all governments. So that's the general picture, but since Rousseau is writing about inequality in this, it's worth it to draw out those lessons. Remember, state of nature, yes, there are inequalities, but they're not relevant. Everyone can feed themselves. etc. But think about how important inequalities are once there are these permanent social institutions. So think about uh, inequality in intelligence. Think about how society, with things like school, college, salaries, amplifies those kinds of differences. Or think of beauty, etc. And so, um, though we have these inequalities in nature, they don't matter much. But once we're in society and eventually in government, the inequalities are drastically magnified. And that's ultimately the source of why we end up being jerks to one another, is due to these inequalities that if we were in a state of nature, we would not care. So, humans by nature are naturally virtuous, clever, but that doesn't really matter because they're able to see to their own needs because they're just another animal. And in essence, Rousseau is saying society makes humans worse. Hobbes, in an important sense, is saying the opposite, that, well, humans are naturally self-interested, but ultimately we need society to survive, which requires that we get along with other members of society, which introduces kind of this notion of ethics that we have in society. Um, Other similarities and differences we already talked about. So they both agree there's no justice or injustice in a state of nature, no morality or immorality in a state of nature. So they agree on that. What do they disagree about? They disagree about a point of science about whether there's competition or not. They also disagree about whether we can have society without government. Rousseau says yes, Hobbes says no. But notice that difference is actually a product of human nature. If humans are these completely self-interested jerks who have no compelling reason to keep their word, then no, you can't form a society without an enforcing power like a government. But if humans are naturally virtuous, as Rousseau says, then we have good reason to think we can actually have a society without government. One last reminder here as I wrap up. These are philosophical differences about human nature. Why? Because we can't observe them in the sciences. What do I mean by that? Uh, Hobbes and Rousseau don't disagree about how humans are in society. That's observable. There's no question that humans are a certain way when they're in society. The interesting question is how we are in society reflective of how we are naturally. So the sciences cannot observe humans in a state of nature because what would that take? They'd have to basically have some child that is raised in the wild and then have them have kids to have a child who is completely raised in the wild and start to try to observe how they act without actually interacting with them. That would be wildly inhumane and cruel and probably impossible in terms of feasibility. And so, how humans are without any um, aspect of society informing their actions, that's just something that we have to leave as a philosophical topic because it's just one that the sciences aren't going to be able to handle. But that's an important thing to be thinking about. How are humans naturally? What kind of evidence can you bring to support your view? That's a great thing to write about in the discussion board. Does Rousseau or Hobbes seem to have a better grasp on how humans would be naturally, not in society, but naturally? And so I'll end once again. Reminder on the next exam: when you're talking Hobbes, when you're talking Rousseau, pay very close attention to whether we're talking about a context when they're in the state of nature, when they're in a civil state, or if you're Rousseau, when they're in between, when they're in a society without a civil state. Those are going to have different considerations, and so be aware on that. All right, post your questions on Blackboard. We will see you some other time.